Violence has a tendency of shadowing man wherever he walks. It seems intrinsical to our development, or at least forms a vital chapter in a wider story. But all of these chapters are not violent. There's a time for war, and a time for peace. Of course, violence tends to have a residual effect and linger into times of peace. The solutions necessary in wartime might not be necessary in peace, yet when the warriors come home they bring these solutions with them. We find this happening again and again in history. 30 Years' War, the World Wars, and who knows what the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine conflict will be like. And this is why I find the topic of this video to be relevant. Learning of how piracy was dealt with in the 17th and 18th centuries can help us in the future with solving the residual conflicts of violent times. And if you don't care about this at all, then you can just enjoy this little slice of pirate history. Piracy did not come out of nowhere. A bunch of guys getting together on a boat and deciding to steal stuff were actually quite rare. Most pirates had been bred into the practice by war. During the 17th century, European governments weren't rich enough to employ large-scale navies. So when they went to war, they simply didn't have enough ships to fulfill the assignments we might expect of a naval force. The solution was to hand out commissions to private ship owners, giving them the permission to capture enemy ships. This would enrich the private persons and harm the enemy's economy. These private men of war were called privateers in English, corsairs in French, and capers in Dutch. Wars were long and privateers grew accustomed to their violent practice. It was profitable. They had families to feed or simply enjoyed spending the money. So when the wars ended, many of them did not know how to stop. The end of conflicts in the 17th and early 18th centuries usually led to a surge in piracy. In 1629, a man named John Smith, a creative name, I know, described this phenomenon as follows. Those that were rich rested with what they had. Those that were poor and had nothing but from hand to mouth turned pirates. Some because they became slighted of those for whom they had got much wealth. Some for that they could not get their due. Some that they lived bravely, would not abase themselves to poverty. Some vainly, only to get a name. Others for revenge, covetousness, or as ill. With seemingly limited options to make their fortunes, these disgruntled former privateers became pirates. Things were a bit different in the American colonies. They had even less money than the governments at home and could barely afford any defense at all. So privateers became the cheapest, most numerous, and most reliable form of defense. When anchored, the privateers could act as a colonial militia. When at sea, the best defense was a good offense. Their purpose was also economic. They stimulated the developing economies by selling cheap plunder and then spending their earnings on the local establishments. Much of their plunder consisted of slaves, a cheap workforce used for construction projects and agricultural expansion. Privateers were useful, up to a point. As the 17th century progressed, the European governments grew richer and expanded their navies and armed forces. They grew less dependent on privateers. The colonies would also solidify. When trade and agriculture had developed, the economy became self-sufficient and not dependent on an influx of plunder. An increased population and investment allowed local governments to raise militias for their protection, and for the home nations to deploy garrisons of professional soldiers. Privateers became useless, harmful even. In peacetime, the colonies and European nations would pursue peaceful commerce with their neighbors, and even former enemies. The privateers, who turned pirate and continued plundering, became harmful to maintaining trade and diplomatic stability, so they had to be dealt with. The most cost-effective way of dealing with pirates was to offer them a general amnesty. Many of them would be glad to accept it. Most of the pirates in Nassau had been peacetime privateers employed by the governor of Jamaica. They saw themselves as completely legal, so when they were declared pirates for attacking the Spanish and French, they were shocked. They were very glad to accept the king's pardon. Basically, they might not have fathomed the severity of their crimes. It could also be the case that they had done so, and had now just grown tired of pirating, or had simply amassed enough money. The key to a successful amnesty was letting the pirates keep their loot. Greed was the biggest motivator to the current occupation, after all. But the money would only last so long, so they needed the opportunity to make more. You had to give them jobs. Some pirates were able to find employment on their own. Many of the buccaneers had been hunters, on the island of Saint-Domingue. They hunted feral pigs and cattle for the skins and meat, which they smoked over a wooden grill called boucan, hence the name buccaneer. These hunters were well armed, trained, and independent. If the colony was attacked, they were excellent for defending it. They could also be employed in hunting down runaway slaves, putting down slave revolts, and for augmenting military expeditions. But these men were wild and often harmful. On Jamaica, they hunted the feral cattle to extinction. It was common for them to shift between piracy and hunting on a whim. They had to be civilized. One solution was to restrict their hunting, as was done on Saint-Domingue. The French governors would also take a few of their guns away. This promoted the hunters to find other occupations. Since there was plenty of free land available on Saint-Domingue, they would settle down as planters, growing things like sugar, tobacco, or indigo. A settled population formed the foundation of a stable colony. Giving land to pirates was a great way of civilizing them. It was also practiced on Jamaica. During the 1660s, land was sold cheaply to the buccaneers, who built plantations using their stolen slaves and fortunes. In the 70s, pardoned pirates were even handed out land for free, in hopes of anchoring them to society. But as the century progressed, land became ever more scarce, and this solution could not be used as often. Another great way of civilizing pirates was to give them wives. There was a surplus of men in the colonies, so the average Joe struggled at finding a girl to settle down with. The French believed this to be a problem, so in 1671, the governor of Saint-Domingue wrote of the necessity to import chains for all those knaves. By chains, he meant women. And it worked. As the number of women in Saint-Domingue increased, so did the number of filibusters decrease. State-mandated girlfriends. Similar to the hunters were the baymen, or logwood cutters. They were lumberjacks from Jamaica that lived on the Yucatan Peninsula, where they harvested logwood, a type of legume used in dye production. The problem with the baymen was that they were trespassing on Spanish property, thus hurting relations with the Spanish. They would also make piratical incursions against isolated settlements. But they brought in valuable materials and were not as aggressive as actual pirates, so the British never made any attempts at suppressing them, and this would have been hard since they operated outside of British territory. So the Jamaicans actively promoted the logwood trade. They also promoted the so-called sloop trade. This was a smuggling network with the Spanish colonies. It was vital for the Jamaican economy, and even promoted by its governors. Still, it was kind of a bad idea. For one, the products used in the sloop trade were often acquired through piracy. Buccaneers would steal slaves from Spanish-lined ships, sell them in Jamaica, where they were then sold to the Spanish through the sloop trade. As a result, they sent a coast guard to seize both hostile and friendly English ships. Thus, English retaliations against Spanish retaliations became somewhat justified. The sloop trade had largely been implemented by the Jamaican governors to stop piracy, but it really just continued the cycle. Then again, Spain should probably just have allowed its colonies to trade freely. Their restrictions is why the sloop trade sprung up in the first place. Anyway, whilst the English were pretty bad at finding peaceful employment for their privateers, the Dutch and French were much better at it. The Dutch financed their fishing fleet, allowing their sailors to find peacetime employment. Some historians believe this to be a reason why there were so few Dutch pirates active in the early 18th century. And neither were there too many French pirates in the 18th century, especially compared to the 1600s. This was because France had sponsored anti-Spanish piracy during the 1600s, for the sake of their own conflicts, and for the growth of Saint-Domingue. They still undertook anti-piracy measures, even during wartime, but they were slight, barely noticeable, like taking a few guns away, importing women for the filibusters to marry, etc. They never brought the whole hammer down at once, so the transition from piracy to peace was slow in Saint-Domingue, and effective. The French offered generous benefits for their sailors. In the mid-1600s, Louis XIV implemented a naval draft for the enlistment of sailors. The sailors' families received a regular pay when he was at sea. During peace, the sailors still received a reduced pay and exclusive fishing rights. His children received free schooling, and elderly or invalid sailors were paid a pension. A French corsair or filibuster could also find other employment. Unlike their English counterparts, the French Navy was incredibly meritocratic. Jacques Cassard started out as a filibuster at the 1697 raid on Cartagena before he was appointed to command a small squadron in the French Navy. Filibusters like Bertrand de Ogeron and Jean Ducasse ended up as governors of Saint-Domingue. It was often a deliberate policy by Louis XIV to appoint filibuster governors. They knew the affairs of the region, after all. Ducasse was also vice admiral in the French Navy. The English Navy, on the other hand, mistrusted privateers, and its officers looked down on the low-born commanders of the buccaneers. William Dampier, one of the milder buccaneers, was given command of the HMS Roebuck. Owing to disciplinary issues, the voyage ended in his court-martial. In the year 1700, France had become a Spanish ally. Suddenly, the entire colonial world opened its gates to the French. This allowed the filibusters, who had spent their lives ransacking Spanish cities, to now trade with them. They had gone from chasing the treasure fleets to escorting them. Most of the piracy during the Age of Sail was done against the Spanish, largely because they were hostile and declined trade. But now that the French had allied with them, this trade was made possible, and much more profitable than buccaneering. It was hard to find peaceful employ for pirates. Many of them were simply not content with a domestic lifestyle. They wanted to make money quickly, violently, and spend it just as recklessly. Most of the Flying Gang pirates had been happy to accept the 1718 Act of Grace. Woodes Rogers had been appointed governor of Nassau, and now he wanted to put the former pirates to work. He needed help repairing the fort, building houses, clearing vegetation, and farming. However, he learned that this new workforce was horrible to work with. They were just too lazy. The privateer mentality prevented many of them from finding other employ. Settle down? Can't buy land, spent all my money on drinking. Fishing? Too boring. Joining the Navy? No swearing, bad food, bad payment, bad conditions, not enough alcohol, etc. Pirates were really good at complaining. The previous efforts we discussed were usually effective. By offering amnesty, letting them keep their loot, and providing plenty of employ, most privateers could be brought into the fold and civilized. But there were always those really bad eggs who simply refused to lower the black. So when the carrot fails, you use the stick. Now, pirate hunting is a topic worthy of its own video, so guess what I'm gonna do? Initially, this series was just gonna be a single video about the difference in pirates and privateers, but then it split off into the Letter of Marque and Pirates vs. Privateers, and then the coming ones about retirement and pirate hunting. There's just so much to say on these topics. There were three basic groups of pirate hunters. First and most obvious were navy ships. They had the best training and discipline. In the 17th century, the buccaneers were usually able to beat them, but in the 18th century, pirates got their asses kicked. See Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts. Problem with the Navy was that they were usually underfunded, overtasked, and their ships were too big for the Caribbean. Pirates could escape into shallow waters, where big vessels simply couldn't follow. In areas like Africa, the Pacific, and Indian Ocean, the Navy were much more proficient. Navy ships could also perform patrol duties or escort merchant convoys. Patrols were mostly a symbolic gesture, since pirates could learn the routes and how to avoid them. Escorts were more viable, since pirates targeted the merchants, so it would either deter them or give you a chance at beating them. The second option was to have former pirates hired as pirate hunters. A lot of people actually believe that privateers were exclusively pirate hunters. Indeed, some privateering commissions concerned only the capture of pirates. Privateer means only private man of war, after all. A nautical mercenary contracted for any purpose at sea, not only commerce raiding. The idea of setting a thief to catch a thief was considered a good solution at the time. For one, it's a good way of employing privateers in peacetime. Privateers used the same ships as pirates and knew where their hideouts were. The problem, of course, is that many pirate hunters were still pirates at heart, greedy and impatient. If their pirate hunting voyage dragged on for too long, or if they turned sympathetic to their old comrades, they might mutiny and turn pirate themselves. This often happened when pirate hunters were sent far abroad, so they were best used for local operations. They also performed best against other nationalities. Englishmen against Spaniards, Spaniards against the French, etc. Shooting at your own countrymen is never as fun. The third option is a sort of middle ground between privateers and the Navy. Known as country sloops in the English colonies, these were essentially naval militias. A captain was given a commission to defend the colony or catch a pirate, given command of a small vessel, usually a sloop, and a volunteer crew. The Spanish employed their guardacosta in a similar manner. Galleots or piraguas were constructed locally and manned by volunteers. They were given a commission and the duty to catch pirates and smugglers. The problem with the Garda, and all Spanish pirate hunters, was that they usually devolved into pirates themselves, classifying any non-Spaniard as a pirate or smuggler. This facilitated the need for French and English pirate hunters to hunt the Garda, who then turned to piracy themselves. So pirate hunters, if they desired stability and were loyal to their country or colony, they were a great option. But when they were doing it out of greed, it would typically perpetuate the problem. If the pirate hunter succeeded in his task, the captured pirates were best made an example of, both to discourage potential pirates and to encourage the population, to show them that the government is capable of defending them from these wanton murderers, robbers, and rapists. As soon as a pirate was captured, he was without any protection or guarantee of safety. Many pirate hunters executed them on the spot, especially if they knew that the pirate might receive support wherever he was taken to. Some pirates got off scot-free because they could afford a lawyer, or because they had family connections to bail them out. But a trial had its purpose. When facing death, many pirates regretted their crimes and begged forgiveness. Simply killing someone might make them a martyr. The execution itself played a role. Hanging was the most popular. If your neck doesn't snap in the initial fall, it can be a slow, painful, and humiliating way to go. Pirates were scared shitless of hanging. Finally, the bodies were painted with tar, put in iron cages, and hung up on a gibbet at the entrance of a harbor. Any ships that came or went would see this grim warning, the fate that awaited any pirate. Whether it was encouraging or discouraging, it served its purpose. So, what was the best way to combat piracy? When a war concluded, pirates and privateers would be granted a general amnesty, pardoning their crimes and allowing them to keep their loot. Next, they needed to be integrated back into society. This was optimally done by confiscating their weaponry, giving them land, and women to marry and build families with. Then, they needed a well-paying job. Some retired as hunters, others as fishermen, merchants, or plantationers. Others became pirate hunters, because there was inevitably going to be those renegades refusing to accept the amnesty. The navy was seldom available to catch them, or even capable. Pirates were best captured when careening their ships, when they were usually drunk, victims of their own debauchery. The captives would then be brutally executed, and the bodies put on display, made an example of, both as a deterrent and to show your subjects that they were safe. Of course, many pirates got away with their crimes. I've delved some into pardons and retirement jobs in this video, but they are subjects worthy of their own. So, stay tuned. Hello everyone. If you're watching this on the 22nd of September 2023, then tomorrow on the 23rd, I will host a Q&A live stream to celebrate 50k subscribers. The stream will start at the same time as the premiere of this video, so 17 PM Central European, and I think 9 AM Eastern Standard. Hope to see you there. We can talk about history or whatever you want. Cheers to you, and big thanks to my Patreon supporters.